The carriage stank of wet leather and old smoke, and Marisol Ainsworth had counted every minute of the past 4 hours by the rattle of the wheels and the silence of the man across from her. Caspian Holloway, Duke of Vexbridge, had not spoken since they left the church gate at Tremaine. He sat with the practiced stillness of a man accustomed to being studied, one gloved hand resting on the silver head of his cane, the other holding open a letter he had read 3 times without once turning the page. The light through the window caught on the faint white line at his temple, where, at 15, a horse had thrown him into a stone wall and nearly killed him. Her brother had told her that story when she was herself 15 and prone to dramatic sympathies. She had wept for a man she had never met. She regretted it now. "You needn't pretend to read," she said. He did not look up. "I am not pretending. You have been on the same page since Bramwell Crossing. How attentive of you to notice. I notice when something is false." He turned a page then, slowly, deliberately, as if to spite her. "How fortunate for the world, Miss Ainsworth, that you are so reliable a judge of falsehood." She drew her cloak tighter, though it was not the cold that prickled along her arms. It was the way he refused to give her the satisfaction of a quarrel. He had perfected, over the 7 years of their acquaintance, an art of denying her even the dignity of being angry at him. She had been 18 the first time she met him. Her brother Edmund had brought him home from the regiment for a summer, and she had come down the staircase in a yellow muslin dress, certain she would be charming, and the Duke of Vexbridge had looked at her exactly once and said, "Your hem is uneven." Then he had returned to his conversation with her father about drainage, and she had spent the rest of the evening staring at her plate and hating him. He had been 26 then, and already a duke, his father dead 2 years, the great house at Vexbridge Hollow already on his shoulders. She had hated him for 7 years. It was, she sometimes thought, the longest sustained feeling of her life. The carriage lurched over a rut, and her traveling case slid against her ankle. She steadied it with her foot and watched his hand tighten almost imperceptibly on the head of the cane. There had been the riding accident as a boy, and a second one 18 months ago that had left him with the cane and a limp he hid with such precise elegance that strangers did not see it. She saw it. She saw everything about him, which was perhaps the worst part of the long humiliation of knowing him. "How long until we reach Merriford?" 2 hours, if the roads hold. "And if they do not?" "Then we shall be inconvenienced." He turned another page. "Try to bear it bravely." She bit the inside of her cheek hard enough to taste copper. The plan had been simple. Edmund, 3 years married and the father of an infant, had been called north on regimental business and could not escort his sister from her aunt's house at Tremaine to the family seat at Merriford. Edmund's letter to the Duke had been brisk. "You are passing through Tremaine. Take her. I shall be in your debt." The Duke had agreed. Of course he had agreed. He always did the correct thing, even when it meant spending 11 hours in a sealed box with a woman who could not look at him without remembering every cruel kindness he had ever shown her. It was the kindnesses, in the end, that she could not forgive. The cruelty she could understand. But there had been other moments. The night her father died, and Caspian Holloway had stood by the library window for 3 hours, saying nothing, while she sat by the dead fire and shook. The afternoon at the Pemberton hunt, when her mare had stumbled, and he had caught her bridle with such speed she had not seen him move. The book he had sent her without a card on her 21st birthday, in a binding so fine she had wept, and she had never, in 3 years, found the courage to ask him whether it had been him at all. These were the unforgivable things, the small evidences that he had, on occasion, seen her. The proof that the rest of the time he was choosing not to. "You are staring," he said, without lifting his eyes. "I am not." "You were." I was thinking. How alarming for us all. She turned to the window. They were passing through the shoulder of the Marlow Downs now, the road climbing in slow turns through stands of leafless beech, and a thin mist had begun to rise from the earth like breath. "Your sister-in-law writes to me," he said abruptly. She looked back at him. "Helena? She informs me that you are betrothed." The carriage went very small around her. She could hear her own pulse in her ears. "She informs you. In a postscript, she seems to have assumed I knew. And do you congratulate me?" "That depends," he said, "upon whether the news is true." She stared at him. He had not lifted his eyes from the letter. His face in the gray light was as composed as a portrait, and she could see, only because she had spent 7 years studying him, the small white tightening at the corner of his mouth. "It is not entirely settled," she said. "How partially settled is it? Mr. Tarek has spoken to my brother. My brother has not yet given an answer. Your brother will give the answer you desire. I do not know what I desire." He turned another page. "Then I congratulate you on your candor, if not your decisiveness." She felt the heat climb her throat. Linus Tarek was not a bad man. He was the second son of a baronet, whose estate marched along the western edge of Merriford, and he had courted her for nearly a year. She had not loved him. "You disapprove," she said. "I have no opinion on the matter." "You have an opinion on every matter." "On this matter," he said, "I am precisely indifferent." The word hit her with such force she had to turn back to the window. Indifferent. He had said it the way another man might have said, enchanted or appalled. It was, in its way, the most violent thing he had ever said to her, and he had said it without raising his voice, without lifting his eyes. She understood then, with a clarity that startled her, that she had been waiting. She had been waiting for 7 years. She had refused 2 offers and delayed a third because somewhere, in the part of her that did not consult her reason, she had been waiting to see whether the Duke of Vexbridge would ever look at her the way he had looked at her once, the night her father died. She had been waiting, and he was indifferent. "Then you will not object," she said, and her voice was steady. "If I accept him?" "I have already said, I have no view." "Good." She lifted her chin. "I will accept him at Merriford." He turned another page. The carriage struck a rut so deep that her case overturned, and a sudden cry from the coachman cut through the wood of the box. The horses shied, the carriage tilted, and for a long, sickening moment, she thought they would go over. Caspian's hand shot out and caught her wrist, hard, hauling her across the seat against him, and the cane fell with a clatter as he braced his other arm against the door. Then, with a great groan, the carriage settled, leaning drunkenly to one side. She was pressed against his chest. His arm was an iron bar across her back. She could hear his heart, very fast, against her ear, and she could feel, just at her wrist, where his hand still gripped, the unsteady pulse of his own. "Are you hurt?" "No." "Are you certain?" "Yes." He did not let her go. For a long moment he did not let her go, and she did not move, and she felt, against the side of her face, the slow, hard work of his breathing as he steadied himself. Then he released her wrist as though it had burned him and pushed her gently upright, and reached for his cane. "Stay where you are. I shall see what has happened." He pulled the door open against the angle and stepped down into the road. She sat very still, with her wrist held against her chest, where the warmth of his glove still lay on her skin, and she understood, with a dread that had nothing in it of surprise, that the journey was not going to end in 2 hours. It wasn't going to end at all. The axle was broken. She could see it from the window, the long pale split running through the wood like a wound, and she could see the coachman standing in the road with his cap in his hand, gesturing helplessly, and she could see Caspian listening, his head bent slightly, the cane planted in the mud, his greatcoat dark across the shoulders with the beginning of rain. He came back to the carriage door and looked up at her. His face was rinsed of expression. "We cannot continue." "How far is the nearest house?" "Drowmere. 2 miles. There is an inn. The coachman believes we may walk it before the weather turns in earnest." She nodded, because there was nothing else to do. She gathered her cloak and her small case, and he handed her down into the road. The mud sucked at her boots. The rain was light still, but cold, a needling rain that found the gaps at her collar and sleeve and made her shiver before they had walked 20 paces. "Take this." He shrugged out of his greatcoat before she could protest and laid it across her shoulders. It was warm from his body and smelled of cedar and of rain. "Your Grace, I cannot." "You can." She did not argue further. They walked in silence. The road bent down through a stand of pines, and beyond it, at the foot of the slope, a thin smoke rose against the sky. The village of Drowmere announced itself slowly through the trees, a scatter of stone houses, a small gray church, an inn at the crossroads, with a sign she could not yet read, swinging in the wet wind. The inn was called the Saint and Sparrow. They were greeted in the yard by a woman in an apron, whose face went through several rapid calculations as she registered the cane, the greatcoat draped over the lady's shoulders, and the muddy state of them both. "Your Grace," she said, with a curtsy that suggested she had at some point recognized him. "Mrs. Halloran." He inclined his head. "I had not expected to see you so far from Vexbridge Hollow." "My sister has the inn, Your Grace. I came down a fortnight past to help her through the winter. Our carriage has come to grief 2 miles east. We require shelter for Miss Ainsworth, and a message sent to Merriford as soon as may be." The woman's eyes flicked very briefly to Marisol, and then away. "Of course, Your Grace. Come within." Inside, the inn was small and clean and warm, smelling of bread and damp wool and the peat fire on the hearth. Marisol allowed herself to be led to a bench by the fire. She allowed Mrs. Halloran to take the greatcoat and her own wet cloak and her gloves. She allowed a cup of something hot to be pressed into her hands. She did all this without speaking, because she had begun to understand that something had happened in the carriage that she could not yet name. Caspian had remained at the inn door, conferring with Mrs. Halloran in a low voice. Marisol watched him over the rim of the cup. He did not look at her. He had not looked at her properly since the carriage had tilted and he had let her go. Mrs. Halloran's expression settled into something polite and apologetic. Caspian said something she could not hear. Mrs. Halloran shook her head. Then he turned and crossed the room and stood before the fire and looked at Marisol at last. "There is a difficulty." "What kind of difficulty?" "There is one room available." She set the cup down very carefully. "One room," she said. "The inn is full. There is a fair tomorrow at Wenslow, and travelers have stopped here for the night. Mrs. Halloran has given up her own chamber to a family with 3 children. There is precisely one room remaining, and it is small." She looked at him. He looked back at her, and his face was once again the face of a portrait, beautifully composed, perfectly remote. "I see. I have asked whether there is any other house in the village. There is none. The rector is at Bath. There is no private carriage to be hired. And so? And so you will take the room. I shall sit up in the parlor. In a public parlor, all night. It is no hardship." "It is a very considerable hardship, and you know it. I have sat up in worse places, Your Grace." "Miss Ainsworth." His voice was perfectly level, and it was the levelness that betrayed him, because there was a thread inside it pulled too tight. "Permit me, on this occasion, to manage the arrangements as I see fit." She felt the heat begin in her chest and climb her throat, and she set her jaw and let it climb. "The arrangements are these. I am alone in a country inn with a man who is not my husband, my brother, or my father. We have been seen together by a woman who will tell at least one person, who will tell 2 more, and by tomorrow noon there will be a rumor in 3 counties. Whether you sleep in the parlor or under the table, the damage is done. It is not done if no one knows you are here. Mrs. Halloran knows. Mrs. Halloran is in my employ. Her sister works at this inn. Mrs. Halloran is the housekeeper at Vexbridge Hollow. She has been so for 19 years. She is here on leave. She will say nothing. And the others? The family with 3 children. The travelers in the common room. The boy in the yard who took the horses. The boy in the yard is 14 and was paid a shilling to remember nothing. The travelers in the common room are passing through to the fair. They have not seen you." She stared at him. It was the most efficient thing she had ever heard him say. "You would lie. I would protect you." From what? From precisely the rumor you describe. By concealing me. By hiding me in a back parlor like a piece of stolen plate. By preventing the catastrophe that will otherwise befall you. And what of you? I am not at risk. You are at every risk. If this is discovered, you will be required to marry me, and you have already made plain how you would feel about such a thing. You are indifferent, Your Grace. You said so yourself an hour ago. Why on earth would you take this trouble for a woman who is nothing to you?" He did not answer. She rose from the bench. The cup rattled on the stone hearth. "Why?" "Because your brother is my friend." "Edmund." She laughed, a short, ugly sound she had not made since girlhood. "Of course. Edmund. It is always Edmund. Marisol." She stopped. He had never used her given name. In 7 years he had never used it, not once, not even on the night her father died. "Do not," she said very quietly. "Do not call me that. Not now. I beg your pardon. You will call me by my given name in a country inn, after refusing to do so for 7 years, in any drawing room in England. Do not flatter yourself that the difference is lost on me." His eyes did not move from her face. She had never, in all the time she had known him, had so much of his attention at once, and it was unbearable. "I'm sorry." "For what? For the carriage? For the road? For the inn? For asking you to sit through a journey with a man who was not equal to it? What does that mean?" He was silent. Caspian. She had not meant to say it. She had never said it. The name fell out of her like a stone dropped down a well, and she heard it strike the bottom, far below, and there was no calling it back. He drew in a single breath, long and careful, and then he walked to the parlor door and put his hand on the latch and stood for a moment with his back to her. "You may have the room," he said. His voice had returned to the cool height from which she had known it for 7 years. "The maid will show you up. I shall arrange for a message to be sent to Merriford at first light. You should be home by tomorrow afternoon. With any fortune at all, no one beyond this house will know that you were ever absent from it." "Caspian." "You may leave," he said. He did not turn. "You may leave, Miss Ainsworth. The maid is waiting." She stood in the parlor with the fire at her back and the rain at the window, and for the second time in an hour, she understood something she did not wish to understand. She had imagined, once or twice, in the secret, unsupervised hours of her own mind, what it would be to hear the Duke of Vexbridge address her in some moment of rare, unguarded truth. She had not imagined it would sound like this, like a door closing, very gently, on the only room in the house that had ever been warm. She walked to the parlor door. He did not look at her as she passed. She climbed the narrow stairs behind a maid she did not see, and entered a small, clean room with a single bed and a basin, and she sat down on the edge of the bed and did not weep, because she had decided, somewhere on the staircase, that she would not give him even that. She did not sleep. Sometime before dawn she rose and dressed in her own dry clothes and went down through the silent into the yard, where a cart was being loaded for the road north. She gave the carter half the coin in her purse and her name, which was not Ainsworth that morning but her mother's maiden name, and she climbed onto the bench beside him as the first gray began to lift behind the church. She did not look back at the windows of the Saint and Sparrow. She did not know that one of those windows, the lower one on the left where the parlor fire had burned all night, framed a man who had not slept either, who sat with the cane across his knees and the unread letter face down on the table, and who watched the cart turn out of the yard onto the north road with an expression that no one, in the long, careful history of his face, had ever seen on it before. He did not move for a long time after the cart was gone. Then he rose and walked to the cold hearth and said to the empty room, in a voice that held nothing of the Duke at all, "Marisol." He did not know, at first, that she was gone. Mrs. Halloran came to the parlor at 7:30 with bread and a pot of tea. She had laid a fire. She had drawn the curtain back from the east window. She had done all of it without a word, and only when she paused at the door did he raise his head. "Mrs. Halloran, Your Grace, has the lady been called?" The pause was the thing that told him. It was a very slight pause, the smallest possible hesitation, and in 19 years, Mrs. Halloran had never hesitated when answering him about anything. "Your Grace, the lady left at first light." He was on his feet before he had decided to stand. The cane went over against the side of the chair. He did not pick it up. "Left. On the cart that goes north to the fair. I did not know until Annie came in to lay the kitchen fire and said the gentleman's lady had gone with old Mr. Pell. North. To Wenslow, Your Grace, or so I understood. Mr. Pell does not go further than Wenslow." "Did she leave word?" "No, Your Grace. Annie said she paid Mr. Pell in coin and gave a name that was not her own. No, she would not have done." He walked, because to remain still would have been to feel the room move under him, and he had a great horror of that sensation. He had felt it twice in his life, once in the moment the horse had thrown him into the wall as a boy, and once again at the second accident when the gig had overturned. He had felt it also last night in the carriage, when she had said indifferent back to him, in a voice that had made the words sound like a thing she had been struck with, and he had not been able for 7 full seconds to find air. "Mrs. Halloran." "Yes, Your Grace." "Send to the stable. I want a horse, the best they have." "Your Grace, the road." "The road will hold or it will not. Send to the stable." "Your Grace, you cannot ride. The doctor at Vexbridge." "Mrs. Halloran." He turned from the window. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "Send to the stable." She curtsied and went. He stood in the empty parlor with the fire crackling at his back and looked down at the cane where it had fallen against the chair, and he thought, with a clarity that was almost peaceful, that he had at last done the thing he had spent 7 years preparing not to do. He had let her go. He had said "you may leave" in a voice he had used 1,000 times to dismiss footmen and stewards and minor cousins, and she had taken him at his word, because she was a woman who had been told for 7 years that she was nothing in particular to him, and she had at last believed it. He had built that belief in her stone by stone over 7 years. Every cool look, every Miss Ainsworth spoken in place of any softer name. He had built it because the alternative had not been available to him, because a duke whose father had ruined the family fortune in a single bad season did not have the luxury of marrying a girl with a respectable dowry when he had 3 estates mortgaged to the rafters and a sister still unprovided for. He had told himself that he was protecting her. He had told himself that a woman of 19, of 20, of 23 would form some other attachment, would marry some better man, would forget that she had once come down a staircase in a yellow dress and looked at him as though he were the answer to a question she had been asking all her life. He had been wrong. He had been wrong about that. And he had been wrong about what would happen to him on the morning he discovered that she had gone. Mrs. Halloran returned. "The horse is being saddled, Your Grace. Forrest says the road north is passable as far as Wenslow if you keep to the high side." "Thank you. Your Grace." "Yes. The cane." He looked down. He had been standing without it for some minutes, and the leg was beginning to make its presence known in the small, bright way it did when he had asked too much of it. He bent slowly and picked up the cane. "Your Grace, forgive me. You should not ride. I have ridden with worse, Mrs. Halloran." "You have, but not for some years." He looked at her then, properly. She had been part of his household since he was a young man, and she had sat up with him through the long convalescence after the second accident, and she had never, in all of that, said anything to him she had not been required to say. She was observing him now. "Mrs. Halloran, Your Grace, you were about to say something." "Yes, Your Grace." "Say it." She drew herself up. She had a small, very straight back, and she used it. "I have served Vexbridge Hollow for 19 years. I do not pretend to understand the matter that has been settled here this morning. I do not ask. But I will say this." She paused. She looked him directly in the face. "If you do not ride after her, Your Grace, you will not know peace again. Not in this house. Not in any house. Not for the rest of your life. And I have served your peace. I will not see you lose it for want of a horse." He stared at her. She curtsied very precisely and went out. The fire popped behind him. Somewhere in the yard a man called to another about a girth strap. He stood in the parlor for one more moment, with the cane in his hand and the unread letter on the table, and he thought of a yellow dress on a staircase and a hem he had said was uneven, because to say anything else would have been to say the thing he had spent the next 7 years not saying, and now he had said it after all. And he had said it in the worst possible word, and she had heard him, and she had gone. He went out into the yard. The horse was a tall bay with a wild eye and a deep chest, and Forrest the ostler held the bridle with the expression of a man who hoped very much that the gentleman in question would not try to mount. Caspian mounted. The leg told him with great immediacy what it thought of the matter. He ignored it. "North Road, Your Grace?" "North Road. How far to Wenslow?" 7 miles, Your Grace, if you take the cut at Bramwell Foot." "The cut? It will be soft, Your Grace." "I do not care." He turned the horse toward the gate. Mrs. Halloran was at the parlor window. She did not wave. She inclined her head, very slightly, and he inclined his. And then he put his heels to the bay and went out of the yard at a canter, and the cane he had left propped, for the first time in 18 months, against the wall of the Saint and Sparrow. He did not know, as he rode out, that he would not find her at Wenslow. He did not know that the cart of old Mr. Pell had turned off 3 miles short of the town, at a crossroads called Hartshorn, and that Marisol Ainsworth, traveling under her mother's name, had paid a second carter to take her west toward the coast, where her aunt's cousin kept a house at Lyrebridge, in which she had once spent a summer at 12, and had been, briefly, perfectly happy. What he knew, as the bay found its stride on the wet road, and the wind came up off the downs and went through his coat as though he were not wearing one, was that the woman he had been refusing to want for 7 years had taken something from him as she went, and that he hadn't until this morning understood that he had it to lose. He had called it indifference. She had called it by its right name, and walked out into the dark with it in her hand. And he was riding now, on a horse he should not have been riding, after a woman he had not yet, in any honest hour of his life, said the true name of even to himself. He said it now, out loud, into the wind. Marisol. The bay's ears flicked once, and the road bent ahead of him into the trees, and the Duke of Vexbridge, who had been a model of composure for 7 careful years, rode after a woman who had taken his peace with her, and he did not look back. The cart of Mr. Pell smelled of wet hay, and Marisol sat on the bench with her case at her feet, and her hands folded inside her cloak, and watched the road unspool behind them in the gray pre-dawn light. Mr. Pell was a man of perhaps 70, with a profile like a kindly hawk, and he had asked her exactly 2 questions in the first mile. Where was she bound? Did she require a blanket? He had accepted her answers with the same nod he had given the horse when it had shied at a fox, and he had not spoken since. She was grateful for the silence. She had decided, in the small, clean room at the Saint and Sparrow, that she would not weep over the Duke of Vexbridge in any vehicle, public or private, for the remainder of her life. The cart turned at a crossroads marked by a stone pillar with the name Hartshorn cut into it, and Mr. Pell drew up at the verge. "This is as far as I go, miss." "Yes. There's a man yonder will take you on to Lyrebridge if the price suits him. His name is Coombs. He's not unkind." "Thank you." She paid him. He touched his hat to her without surprise, as though he had carried any number of women under invented names along this road and had long ago ceased to wonder why. She climbed down. Mr. Pell clucked to his horse, and the cart went on north toward Wenslow, and she stood at the crossroads in a country she did not know, with the cold beginning to find its way through the seams of her boots. She had been Miss Ainsworth of Merriford when she went to bed last night. She had risen this morning a different person. The man Coombs was found behind a low stone barn at the edge of the crossroads. He was younger than Mr. Pell, perhaps 40, with a thick brown beard and the wary eyes of a man who had been cheated more than once in his life and intended not to be cheated again. He looked at her case, at the coin she offered, and at the road behind her, in that order. Lyrebridge. Yes. That's 23 miles. 2 days, the way the roads are. I will pay for the second day. He named a price. She paid half on the spot and promised the rest at journey's end. And within the quarter hour she was on the road again, going west now instead of north. She did not look behind her. She thought instead, with a deliberateness that was almost a discipline, of her aunt's cousin, Mrs. Quill, at Lyrebridge. Mrs. Quill was a widow of independent means, 60 years old, the keeper of a comfortable stone house above a small harbor, and Marisol had spent a summer with her at the age of 12 when her mother had been ill. She remembered the low whitewashed parlor with its round window and a path down through a wood of stunted oaks to a beach of pale shingle where she had collected 47 small flat stones with holes worn through them. Mrs. Quill had told her that such stones were called hagstones and that the country people held them lucky. She had not seen Mrs. Quill in 11 years. She had written to her at Christmas every year, and Mrs. Quill had answered every letter, and the correspondence had been the thin, steady thread by which Marisol had maintained her sense that there existed, somewhere in England, a place she had once been happy. She knew only that Mrs. Quill was the one person in England to whom she could go at the present moment without having to explain the present moment to anyone who would think it required explanation. The cart went on. The sun rose properly. The road climbed a long shoulder of moorland, dropped through a hamlet of 3 houses and a forge, and by mid-morning, Coombs drew up at a wayside cottage where a woman gave them bread and beer and asked Marisol no questions at all. They went on. It was afternoon when she became aware, at the edge of her hearing, of a horse coming up behind them at a steady canter on the road they had just traveled. She did not turn. She told herself that any number of horses might be on this road. She told herself that even if a horse were following her, it could not be the horse she feared, because the man she feared did not ride. She had not seen him on a horse in 5 years. The doctor at Vexbridge had forbidden it after the second accident. Edmund had told her so in a letter. Edmund had said, with the casual cruelty of a brother, "Poor Holloway, he takes it hard, but he will not ride again." The horse drew nearer. She could hear, now, the rhythm of its hooves on the wet stone of the road, and the breath of it, and the creak of leather. And she could hear, also, the absence of any conversation between rider and horse, the silence of a man riding alone who was not interested in being heard. "Coombs, how fast can this horse go?" He looked at her. "Not fast, miss. He's a steady fellow. Why?" "Pull off the road, behind that barn." He looked at her, at the road behind, at her face, and to his credit, he did not argue. He turned the cart in 3 close movements off the road and behind a long, low stone barn at the corner of a field, and he drew up in its shadow, and the horse stood breathing softly, and the cart was perfectly still, and Marisol sat with her hands gripping the bench under her cloak and listened. The hoofbeats came on. They reached the spot in the road where the barn began. They paused. There was a long, considering pause in which she could hear the horse blow once, sharply, and a man's breath catch. Then the hoofbeats went on, and on, and on, and faded west along the road toward Lyrebridge. She let out a breath she had not known she was holding. "Miss." "Yes." "Was that a man you were running from?" She considered. It was, she found, more difficult to answer than she would have expected. "Yes." He nodded slowly. "You will tell me, miss, if I am to be paid for trouble as well as for distance." "You will be paid for trouble." "Then I am content." He waited a careful 10 minutes, by his pocket watch, and then he turned the cart back onto the road, and they went on, and the road was empty, and the sun by now was past its zenith and beginning to slope toward the western sea. She thought all that afternoon about the pause. It had been the pause of a man who knew the road and was looking very carefully at the ground for the marks of cartwheels that had turned off it. It had been the pause of a man who, for whatever reason, had decided not to investigate the barn and had instead ridden on along the road that the cart was supposedly still traveling in the hope of overtaking it before nightfall. He had been so close. He had been 10 yards from her, perhaps 12, and she had not breathed, and he had not breathed, and the only thing between them had been a stone wall, and the question of which of them was the more determined, at that moment, not to be found by the other. She had won. It didn't feel like winning. The first day passed without further sign of the bay horse. Coombs drove until dusk, and they slept that night at a small farm where his cousin kept a bed for travelers, and Marisol lay on a straw mattress under a sloped roof and dreamed of a yellow dress and a staircase and a man saying your hem is uneven in a voice that was the kindest thing anyone had ever said to her, though she could not, in the dream, work out why. They went on at first light. They reached Lyrebridge late on the second afternoon, when the light had begun to take on the particular pewter softness of the sea, and Coombs drew up at the foot of the lane that led up to Mrs. Quill's house, and Marisol paid him the second half of his fee and added a coin for his discretion, and he touched his hat and went away down toward the harbor. She stood at the foot of the lane with her case and looked up at the house she had not seen in 11 years. It was smaller than she remembered. The whitewashed walls had aged to a soft cream, and the slate roof had gone darker, and the round window in the parlor was exactly where it had always been, and a tabby cat sat on the front step washing its face in the last of the sun, She walked up the lane and knocked at the door. It was opened by a woman who, at 60, had the upright carriage, and the very direct gray eyes that Marisol now remembered were her own mother's eyes, set in a face her mother's face had never quite resembled. Aunt Quill. The woman looked at her for the space of perhaps 2 heartbeats. Then she stepped back and held the door wide and said, in a voice that was perfectly calm, "Come in, child. Come in. The kettle is on." It was only when the door had closed behind her and Mrs. Quill had taken her cloak and the kitchen smelled of toasted bread and wood smoke, and the tabby cat had come to wind itself around her ankles as though it remembered her, that Marisol began, finally, to weep. She wept, standing up in the middle of the kitchen with her hands over her face, and Mrs. Quill did not approach her, and did not ask her any question, and did not say a single word of comfort. Mrs. Quill went to the dresser and took down a cup and put a slice of bread on a plate, and set them both at the kitchen table, and pulled out a chair and waited. After some long time, Marisol sat down and drank the tea and ate a corner of the bread, and Mrs. Quill said, "You will tell me what you wish to tell me. The rest is not my concern. I have come without warning. You have. I have very little money. You have a roof, child. You will have it as long as you require it. I have done a foolish thing. Most useful things look foolish in their first hour. Drink your tea." She drank. The tabby cat jumped onto the bench beside her and pressed its warm side against her thigh, and she put her hand on its back and felt, for the first time in 3 days, a creature whose weight she could bear. "My brother will write to you. He will. I shall answer him. I shall tell him you are with me, and well, and wish for the present not to be disturbed. He will not press me. Edmund knows me. He will be angry. He will be relieved. Anger is what men show when they have been frightened, and your brother loves you. Aunt Quill, yes, there is also a man who may write. He may also come. And what shall I tell him?" She considered. She turned the cup slowly between her hands. The tabby cat had begun to purr. "Tell him, I am not here." Mrs. Quill looked at her for a long time. It was the look of a woman who had married once a man who had been the great love of her life, and who had then refused, through 40 years of widowhood, every other suitor on the principle that a thing of that order was not to be sought twice. "I shall tell him what you bid me tell him, but I shall ask you, child, to be certain it is what you wish. A door of that kind, once closed, is not always reopened." "It was already closed, Aunt Quill. I am only walking away from the side of it I was standing on." "Ah," Mrs. Quill set her own cup down. "Then you have come to the right house." That night, Marisol slept in a small white room with a sloping ceiling and a window that gave onto the harbor, and the sound of the sea came up to her in long, slow strokes, and she slept 10 hours without waking. She woke to the smell of bacon and to gray light off the water, and she came down to find Mrs. Quill at the table with a letter open in her hand. "It came an hour ago, by a boy from the post road. He waited for an answer. I sent him away with one. Caspian." She had not meant to say his name. She heard it leave her mouth. She did not take it back. Mrs. Quill regarded her over the rim of her spectacles. "The Duke of Vexbridge. Yes. He writes very well. He has been at Wenslow for 2 days. He has now ridden as far as Lyrebridge. He is at the anchor on the harbor. He says he will not enter this house unless you summon him. He says he requires only 1/4 of an hour of your time, and that, after it, he will trouble you no more." Marisol sat down very slowly at the table. "What did you answer?" "I answered that the lady of whom he wrote was not here. He did not believe me. But he accepted my answer, and he sent the boy back with another letter, which he asked me to keep against any future appearance of the lady. I have not opened it." She set a folded paper on the table between them. It bore Marisol's name on its face, in a hand she had seen only twice in her life, both times on the flyleaf of a book that had arrived without explanation on her 21st birthday. The hand was upright, very precise, slightly canted. She had spent hours, once, comparing it against the hands of every man she could think of. She had never been certain. She had only suspected. She did not open the letter. She slid it back across the table. "Keep it for me. Child, keep it. Please. I cannot read it today. I cannot read it tomorrow. Perhaps in a week. Perhaps in a month. Keep it, Aunt Quill. And if I ask you for it, give it to me. If I do not ask, then it will be your decision when the time comes." Mrs. Quill folded the letter and put it into the drawer of the dresser where the tabby cat slept. And she closed the drawer with a small, dry click, and she said, "Eat your bacon." That afternoon she went down to the beach. She went down through a wood of stunted oaks she had walked through 11 years ago, and the path was narrower than she remembered, and the trees were smaller. But the sound of the sea at the foot of it was exactly as it had been, and when she came out onto the pale shingle, she stopped, and stood, and breathed, and was 12 years old again for the space of 2 long breaths. The tide was low. She walked along the high-water line, and after a while she bent, without thought, and picked up a small, flat stone with a hole worn through it. She turned it over in her palm. She put it in her pocket. She walked on. The wind was in her hair. The sea was the color of slate. There was a small, dark figure standing on the shingle 100 yards ahead of her, looking out at the water, very still. She knew, with the immediate animal knowledge of the body, before her mind had caught up at all, that the figure was Caspian Holloway. He had not seen her. He was facing the sea. The wind was off the water, blowing his coat back at the shoulders, and he was leaning, very slightly, on a stick that was not his cane, a piece of driftwood he had picked up, perhaps on the beach. His head was bare. The wind had taken his hair and lifted it from his temples, and she could see, even at this distance, the white line at his hairline where the horse had thrown him. He was thinner than she remembered. He looked like a man who had not eaten properly in some considerable time, and she understood, with a small, sick lurch of the stomach, that she was looking at the cost of 3 days. She stopped where she was. She stood on the shingle and looked at him, and he did not turn, and the wind took the sound of her steps out to sea. She thought of the letter in the dresser drawer. She thought of the 7 years. She thought of the word indifferent, said in a carriage in the rain, in a voice that had been so carefully level she had not understood, until this moment on the shingle, that the levelness was the lie. She turned, very quietly, and walked back the way she had come, into the wood, up the path, between the small oaks, and home. Mrs. Quill was at the kitchen window when she came in. "You saw him. How did you know?" "Because you have come back with that face on you. Sit down." Marisol sat. She put her hand into her pocket and closed it around the small, flat stone with a hole worn through it, and she held it there for a long time, and she did not weep this time, and she did not speak. She understood the thing she had understood on the staircase at the inn, but had not been ready then to look at directly. She had not stopped loving him. She had only stopped waiting to be loved back. It was, she discovered now, a very different thing. He did not see her on the beach. He stood there a long time after she had gone, looking at the water without seeing it, leaning on the piece of driftwood he had found, because he had left his original cane at the inn at Drowmere, and the leg had begun, in the last hour, to sing in a way that meant he would pay for this day for a week. He did not mind paying. He had paid a great deal more than a week already. He had ridden into Lyrebridge the previous evening on a chestnut mare he had bought at Hartshorn, the bay having gone lame at the second day's halt, and he had taken a room at the Anchor at midnight, and he had not slept. He had written, in the small gray hours before dawn, 2 letters. The first he had written in the careful, courteous, distant hand of a duke who has learned to manage a woman of independent means. He had addressed it to Mrs. Quill. The second letter he had written in another hand altogether. It had taken him 4 hours. He had filled the small writing slope at the Anchor with crumpled drafts that he had then taken, one by one, and burned in the grate. Only the final version had gone with the boy, and even the final version was not what he had wanted to say. He did not know whether she would ever read it. He had walked out of the Anchor at noon to clear his head and to look at the sea. He turned at last from the water and walked, slowly, the long way back along the shingle to the steps that led up to the harbor wall. He went back to the Anchor. He climbed the stairs to his room. He took out a fresh sheet of paper, and he began, for the first time in his life, to write the truth. He wrote that he had loved her since the day she had come down the staircase in a yellow dress and asked him a question with her face that he had not, at 26, possessed the courage to answer. He wrote that he had said, "Your hem is uneven," because to say what he had wished to say would have been to ask her to wait for a man who could not offer her any portion of his life that was not already mortgaged against a debt his father had left him. He wrote that he had, in the 7 years since, refused 2 arranged marriages and broken a 3rd engagement before its public announcement, because he had not been able to imagine bringing another woman into the house at Vexbridge and seating her at the table where he had once seen her, in a yellow dress, at his own elbow on a summer afternoon when she had been a girl of 18. He wrote that he had paid off the last of his father's debts only 3 months ago, that his sister's establishment had been settled by her marriage in the summer, and that his mother, who had been the chief argument for the alliance he had refused, had on her deathbed in October told him he was to please himself, and had said, in her last lucid hour, "That Ainsworth girl, Caspian, the one with the eyes, I always thought," and had not finished the sentence. He wrote that he had been on his way to Merriford when Edmund's letter had reached him at Tremaine, with the precise intention of asking her brother for permission to address her. He wrote that he had sat across from her in the carriage for 4 hours, rehearsing the words he had meant to say at her brother's house, and that he had then heard, in a postscript from her sister-in-law, that she was already promised to another man, and that something in him that he had been holding very carefully for 7 years had broken open, and that he had said indifferent, and that the word had been the most considerable lie he had ever told in his life. He wrote that he had ridden after her on a horse he should not have ridden, and that he had paid for it with a leg that would never quite forgive him, and that he counted the price negligible. He wrote that he was at the Anchor at Lyrebridge, that he would remain there until she sent him away, and that he would, if she sent him away, return to Vexbridge Hollow and live there as a man who had lost his peace and did not expect to find it again in any other house. He wrote that he understood that she was not obliged to read this letter, and that she was not obliged to forgive him. He wrote that he loved her. He wrote it 3 times, in 3 separate places in the letter, because he had spent 7 years not writing it once, and he found that he could not now, having begun, easily stop. He signed it with his given name only. He sealed it and gave it to the boy at the Anchor with a coin, with instructions to put it into Mrs. Quill's own hand. Caspian sat by the window of his room and watched the boy return half an hour later with no answer, only a nod, and he understood that the letter had been received. He sat by the window until the evening came down over the harbor. He did not eat. Sometime after dark, when the lamps had been lit along the harbor wall, there came a knock at the door of his room, and the boy from the Anchor put his head in and said, with the importance of a child entrusted with a serious errand, Your Grace, there is a lady at the door. She says she will not come up. She says you are to come down to her." He rose from the chair so quickly that the leg gave under him, and he had to catch the edge of the writing slope to keep from going to one knee. The boy looked away politely. "What lady?" "She did not give a name, Your Grace. She is in the small parlor at the back. She asked for it particular." "Thank you." He took the driftwood stick from where it leaned against the wall. He went down the stairs slowly, and he came along the passage to the small parlor at the back of the inn, and he stopped at its door. He did not, for a moment, open it. He stood in the passage with his hand on the latch, and he thought, with a small, bright clarity that had nothing in it of hope, and nothing in it of fear, only the steady recognition of a fact, that whatever was in the room behind this door was the rest of his life. He turned the latch. He went in. She was standing at the small fire on the far side of the room, her back to him, her hands folded in front of her, and she did not turn when he entered. She had not taken off her cloak. The hood was down on her shoulders. Her hair, which she had not pinned up since the morning at the inn at Drowmere, was loose at her neck. He closed the door behind him. "Marisol." She did not turn. "I have read your letter," she said. The small, clear voice of her went through him like a cold wind through an open window, and he understood, in that instant, that she had read it, all of it, every word of it, and that she was standing at the fire with her back to him because she had not yet decided what she meant to do with what he had said. He waited. After a long moment, she turned. Her face was very pale. Her eyes were dry. "Sit down, Caspian. Your leg is going to give. I do not wish to have this conversation with you on the floor." He sat. She remained standing. She looked at him a long time. Then she said, in a voice that was almost steady, "I have a great many things to say to you. You will not like all of them. You will not be permitted to interrupt. When I have finished, you will say what you have to say, and after that, we shall see." "Yes, Marisol." She drew a breath that wasn't quite even. She did not sit. She stood at the small fire with her hands clasped in front of her and her hair down at her neck, and she began. She did not begin with the carriage. She began, instead, with the staircase. "You said my hem was uneven. I was 18. I had spent 2 hours dressing. I came down at Mereford, and you looked at me as though I were a clerk presenting an account, and you said, 'Your hem is uneven.' And I went back to my room and unpicked the hem and pinned it again, and stood weeping in front of the glass, because I could not work out which side of it was the unevenness. I never wore the dress again." Caspian sat very still in the chair by the door. The driftwood stick was across his knees. He did not speak. "You called me Miss Ainsworth for 7 years. In drawing rooms, at dinner tables, in the long gallery at Vexbridge, in the 2nd week of August, when there was no one else in the gallery, and the rain was on the windows. And you looked at me, for one moment only, in a way I have spent 4 years pretending not to remember. You called me Miss Ainsworth on the night my father died. You stood at the library window and said, 'Miss Ainsworth, I am very sorry.' And I sat by the fire and shook, and you stayed there for 3 hours. And I did not know whether you stayed, because you could not bear to leave me, or could not bear to come closer. And I do not know now. Marisol." "You will not interrupt." He closed his mouth. She was not looking at him. The firelight was on the underside of her chin, and he saw clearly that she had lost weight in 3 days, that her cheekbones had come up out of her face, the way bones come up when a woman has not been sleeping. "You sent me a book on my 21st birthday. There was no card. The hand on the flyleaf was your hand, but I could not be certain. I asked Edmund. I asked my mother. I never asked you. I came twice within a week of asking. Once at the Pemberton Hunt, and once in your own library at Vexbridge in October, and on both occasions you said something so cool to me that I could not, afterwards, frame the question. Did you send me that book? Yes. Why was there no card? Because if I had put a card in it, I should have had to write a name on the card, and there was no name I could have written that would have allowed me to look at you across a dinner table afterwards. She looked at him then. It was the look of a woman taking the precise measure of a man who had been standing slightly out of focus for 7 years. I see. She turned back to the fire. You caught my bridle at the Pemberton Hunt with such speed, I did not see you move. You had been beside me, on a hunter that was 3 hands taller than my mare, the entire afternoon. She paused. It was not an accident. No. You did this for 7 years. You did not once give me your hand at a dance. You did not once sit beside me at supper. You did not once write me a letter. And in private, in 7 years, you sent me a book without a card. And you caught my bridle. And you came on the night of my father's death to a house you had no obligation to come to, and you stayed 3 hours by the window. You have a right to be angry. I am not finished. He inclined his head. In the carriage 2 days ago, you told me you were indifferent. Yes. You said it in the voice you had used to me for 7 years. I had built my understanding of you on it. And in one word, it came down. You said it about my marriage to Linus Tarrick, who is a perfectly kind man, and to whom I had, until that moment, intended to say yes. She drew a breath. I have not put it away, Caspian. I tried to put it away on the cart of Mr. Pell in the rain, and when I heard your horse on the road behind me, and on the beach this afternoon, when I saw you in the wind with no cane and a piece of driftwood and your hair off your face, and I could not. I sat in my aunt's kitchen this evening with your letter in my hand, and I told myself I would not read it, and I read it. I read the parts where you wrote that you loved me, and the parts in between, and then I came down to this inn, and I told myself I had come to send you home. Marisol, you will not. He did not. She turned, fully, from the fire. She faced him. You wrote that you have been on the way to Merriford to ask my brother for the right of addressing me. Is that true? Yes. You wrote that your mother told you, in October, that you were to please yourself. Is that true? Yes. You wrote that the debts are paid, that your sister is married, that there is no longer any obstacle of any material kind to your offering for the woman of your choice. Is that true? Yes. Then I will ask you the question I have been waiting 7 years to ask you. Do you love me, Caspian? He rose. The leg gave a little, and he caught the back of the chair, and he straightened, and he crossed the small room in 3 steps, and he stopped 1 pace in front of her. I have loved you since the staircase. I loved you when I said your hem was uneven. I loved you in the long gallery in August. I loved you on the night your father died. I loved you when I sent you the book. I loved you when I said indifferent in the carriage, and I knew as I said it that I was destroying the only thing I had ever wanted, and I said it anyway, because I thought it would set you free, and I was wrong, and I am asking you now to forgive me and to allow me to spend the rest of my life proving to you that I have not been indifferent in any hour of any day since I saw you on a staircase in a yellow dress. She was weeping. She wept silently, with her eyes open on his face, and the tears ran down her cheeks and onto the front of her cloak. You have an extraordinary gift for the long sentence, even when you are not trying. I beg your pardon, she laughed. It was a small, wet laugh, and it was the most beautiful sound he had heard in 7 years. He raised his hand. He did not touch her face. He held his hand a hand's breadth from her cheek, and he waited. And after a long moment, she leaned her head, very slightly, into his palm. Her cheek was wet. He closed his eyes for a moment because he had not known, in any of the 7 years, that the loss of all this had been the thing he had been carrying. Caspian? Yes. This is not yet a yes. I know. You have hurt me for 7 years. Not on purpose, perhaps, but every day. Yes. I'm going back up to my aunt's house. Tomorrow I'm going to walk on the beach again, and I'm going to think. You will remain at the anchor. You will not come up to the house. You will wait until I send for you. Yes. She drew back from his hand. She stepped back. She did not turn away. One more question. You wrote that you had broken a 3rd engagement before its public announcement. When? In October, the day after my mother died. Why did you not write to me? Why did you not tell my brother? Because I was on my way to do it. Edmund had written to ask whether I might escort his sister from Tremaine to Merriford. I had 4 hours, Marisol. I had the entire road. And I sat across from you, and I lost my courage at the first turn, and held it lost for 4 hours. And at the end of the 4 hours, your sister-in-law's postscript reached me, and I said the worst possible word, and I lost you. I'm going to write to Helena and ask her 1 or 2 pointed questions about the timing of postscripts. It was not Helena's fault. No, it was nobody's fault, but yours, Caspian. She moved past him toward the door. At the door, she stopped. She did not look back. Sleep, Caspian. Eat. You look as though you have been on the road a year. Yes, I shall send for you. Soon. She went out. The door closed. He sat in the chair. He did not rise from it for a long time. She did not send for him the next day. She walked on the beach in the morning, alone, and she came back at noon, and ate with her aunt, and said almost nothing. And in the afternoon, she sat with a piece of plain sewing in her lap, and did not push the needle through the cloth more than 3 times in the hour. Mrs. Quill let her be. Toward evening, she set the sewing aside. Aunt Quill, I am going to write a letter. She wrote to Edmund. She told him where she was, and that she was well, and that she had left the inn at Drowmere by her own choice, and not by any fault of the Duke of Vexbridge. She told him she had refused, on her own account, Mr. Terrick's offer of marriage. She did not write to him about the Duke. She sealed the letter and went to bed and slept 6 hours. At first light, she went down to the kitchen. I'm going to the anchor. She walked down the lane in a clear, cold morning with the sea bright at the foot of it. She asked the boy at the anchor for the small parlor at the back, and she told him to fetch the gentleman from the room above. She stood at the window, with her hand in her pocket closed around the small flat stone, with a hole worn through it. When she heard him on the stairs, she did not turn. He came in. The door closed. Marisol. Caspian. She turned. He had shaved. He had eaten. He had slept some, she could tell. He was leaning, still, on the driftwood stick, but he was leaning on it less, and she understood that he had spent the night doing the careful and unromantic work of being fit to receive whatever answer she was going to give him. Sit down. He sat. She moved to the small fire. Her hair was up. I have written to my brother. I have refused Mr. Terrick. He did not move. She saw the small adjustment at the corner of his mouth. That is your decision. It is not mine. It is mine. I am only telling you because you have a right to know what I have decided in matters that are mine alone. Thank you. I have not yet decided what I shall do about you. I understand. I do not think you do, Caspian, but you will. She drew a breath. I will not marry you in haste. I will not marry you in secrecy. I will not marry you in any arrangement that requires us to behave as though the 7 years between the staircase and this morning did not happen. They happened. They cost a great deal. I will not pretend them away. No. You will go home tomorrow. You will travel slowly, because of the leg. You will see your sister. You will write to my brother and ask him in a proper letter for the right to address me. Yes. He may answer no. You will respect his answer if he does. Yes. If he answers yes, you will write to me. The letter will be a great deal shorter than the one you wrote me at 3 o'clock in the morning at this inn, and a great deal more difficult to write. He almost smiled. Yes. I will answer it within a fortnight, and whatever I answer, I will mean. If I answer yes, you will come, properly, to Merriford, and you will be received properly by my brother, and you will court me publicly for at least 3 months. 3 months. 3 months. The 7 years condensed. We shall do in 3 months the work that should have been done across the 7, and at the end of it, you will know me, and I will know you in the daylight. Yes. At the end of the 3 months, if we are both still of the same mind, you will ask me again. Properly. And I will give you my answer. You will not, in that 3 months, in any moment of impatience, ask me to shorten the period. And if at any point I tell you I have changed my mind, you will accept it, and you will go home, and you will not return. He was silent. Caspian. I will accept it. Thank you. She moved a step closer to him. She put her hand on his hair, lightly, and she felt under her palm the warm shape of his head and the small white scar at his temple. And then she took her hand away. That is for the staircase, and for the long gallery in August, and for the night my father died, and for the book. Yes, there is a great deal more of it to be done, but it will be done in its proper hour. Caspian, look at me. He looked. She had never, in 7 years, given him this much of her face at once. She let him see it now. What was in her face was not yet love spoken. It was love aloud. It was the first true thing she had ever permitted him to see. Yes, he said. Yes, she said back. She went out. She walked up the lane to her aunt's house in the bright, cold morning, with the small, flat stone in her pocket, and she did not look behind her, because she had stopped being a woman who walked away from the man she loved. She had become, instead, a woman who had told him how to come and find her, and had set him to the work. Edmund's reply reached her at Lyrebridge 8 days later. It was 4 pages. Edmund wrote that he had read her letter 3 times, and had, on the 3rd reading, sat down and cried, which was a thing he had not done in 11 years. He had ridden to Vexbridge Hollow himself. The Duke had received him in the long library, and had stood, and not sat, and had said, before Edmund had finished the first sentence, I have loved her for 7 years. I have been a fool for 7 years. I am asking you now, properly, for the right to address her, and I shall accept any answer you give me. But I don't propose to be a fool for an 8th. They had spoken for 4 hours. At the end, Edmund had risen and shaken Caspian's hand, and said, Very well, Holloway. You have my consent and my blessing, and if you make my sister miserable, I shall shoot you myself. Caspian had answered, I should expect nothing less, and they had then, both, to their own surprise, laughed. Helena sent her contrition. Linus Terrick had behaved with a generosity that did him great credit. The Duke's letter came 2 days later. 4 lines. Marisol, your brother has answered. He has answered yes. I am at Vexbridge. I shall come for you whenever you send for me. See, she returned to Merriford. Edmund met her at the Long Bend 3 miles from the house, and held her hard, and said, You will not do that again. Helena was on the steps with a letter of apology, 17 pages long. 3 days later, the Duke came to Mereford with his sister Cecily as chaperone. He sent in his card. He rose when Marisol entered. He bowed. "Miss Ainsworth, Your Grace, may I begin them now?" "You may begin them now." He took her hand. He bent his head. He kissed it, formally. And it was the first time in 7 years that he had kissed her hand. And it was the most extravagant thing he had ever done in her presence. The courtship was not without incident. In the 3rd week, on a market day at Mereford Village, she came face to face with Linus Tarrick at the cross. He took off his hat. He did not flinch. "Miss Ainsworth, Mr. Tarrick, I am leaving for Bristol on Tuesday. There is a young woman at Bristol, the daughter of the banker Hosmer, whom my mother has long thought of for me. I shall give the matter this winter, and the attention I should perhaps have given it sooner. Mr. Tarrick, I wish you every happiness. I wish you the same, Miss Ainsworth. I think you are about to have it." He bowed and went on. She told Caspian about the meeting a week later. He listened in silence. Then he said, "He is a better man than I have been." And she said, "Yes, and you have the rest of your life to put that right." And he said, "I shall." In the 6th week, the rumor came up out of the country. Mrs. Tarrick, who was Linus's mother and had not forgiven the refusal, told a friend at a tea in Wenslow that Miss Ainsworth had spent a night at an inn at Drowmere with the Duke of Vexbridge unchaperoned. By the 2nd post on Wednesday, it was at Mereford. Caspian did not lose his head. He rode to Wenslow himself. He called on Mrs. Tarrick in her own drawing room, and he was so courteous that she did not know, until afterward, that she had been corrected. He explained that the carriage had broken an axle, that Mrs. Halloran of Vexbridge Hollow had been present at the inn at Drowmere throughout, and that any account that omitted Mrs. Halloran was an account not in possession of the facts. He asked, very gently, whether Mrs. Tarrick would care to write a small line of correction to her friend at Wenslow. She did. The rumor died within a week, the way rumors die when they are answered before they have learned to swim. He told Marisol about it that Sunday, walking in the long avenue at Mereford. She stopped on the gravel. "You did this without telling me." "I did." "I am not certain whether to be grateful or furious. Both, perhaps. You may tell me which it is in the morning." She laughed. She took his arm again. They walked on. In the 2nd week of the courting, he had told her, walking in the long avenue with her gloved hand on his arm, that he had written 4 years ago to a printer in Edinburgh and paid privately for a book to be bound in green calf, because she had once said, in his hearing, that she thought green the most restful color in the world. He told her he had written a card and taken it out of the parcel at the last minute, because to send the card would be to put her under an obligation she was not in a position to refuse. "That card, did you keep it?" "I kept it." "You will give it to me." He gave it to her 3 days later in a small folded paper. She read it standing in the cold avenue. "For the woman whose yellow dress on a staircase I have not forgotten. This is the 2nd love letter you have written me, Caspian. I shall keep them both, and I shall add the others as you write them, and you shall have many years to write them." The 3 months were, in the end, 11 weeks and 4 days, because the Duke came up the drive at Mereford on a Wednesday morning, 4 days short of the agreed term, and asked to see Edmund, and asked to see her mother, and asked to see Marisol, in that order, and proposed marriage to her in the morning room formally, in the manner he had been taught at 15 by his own father. She did not forgive him for the 4 days, then or ever, on principle. She said yes. The wedding was in late February, in the small gray church where her father and mother had been married, and the snow lay in patches in the churchyard. Mrs. Quill came up from Lyrebridge by the coach, and sat in the front pew with a small smile on her face that nobody but Marisol noticed, and nobody but Marisol understood. Mrs. Halloran was at the wedding in a new bonnet the Duke had presented to her 3 weeks earlier, and she gripped the rail of the pew very hard at the moment of the vows, and Marisol smiled at her, and Mrs. Halloran inclined her head in the small, precise way she had, and the thing between them was understood without a word being spoken. That night, in the small bedchamber at the Dower House, he closed the door behind them and did not, at first, come further into the room. She watched him from where she stood by the fire. "Caspian, come here." He came. He set the driftwood stick against the side of the bed. She put her hands on his face. She had never in 7 years touched his face. His skin was warm under her palms, and she felt the small white scar at his temple, and she drew his head down to hers, and she kissed him, lightly, for the first time, on the mouth. It was the kiss of a woman who had decided to begin, in her own time, because she had the rest of her life. When she drew back, his eyes were closed. "Marisol." "Yes. I do not deserve this." "No, you do not. You will spend the rest of your life proving that you do, which is not the same thing as deserving it, but is a useful work for a man to be set to." He almost smiled. She put out the candle. The fire burned low on the hearth. He turned, slowly, and put his arms around her, and she leaned her head against his chest and listened to his heart. And after a long moment, she felt him breathe out, all at once, the breath of a man who has come at last to the end of a long road. "You may speak to me now," she said. "We are no longer required to be quiet. I have nothing in me that requires speech. Then we shall be quiet." They were quiet. 2 years later, in the long gallery at Vexbridge Hollow, on a wet afternoon in the 2nd week of August, Marisol stood at the window and watched the rain go sideways across the park. She had thought, all those years, that this gallery was the room in which Caspian Holloway had once looked at her and not spoken. She understood now that it was the room in which Caspian Holloway had once looked at her and made the decision on which his subsequent 7 years had been built, not to speak yet. It was a different room when you understood that. Behind her, at the far end of the gallery, the door opened. She did not turn. She knew the sound of his step. He had not used the driftwood stick in 9 months. It was on the mantelpiece in the small library, where she had insisted on her first day in this house that it remain. He came up beside her at the window. "Marisol." "Caspian." "Your aunt has written. She is coming for Christmas. She says she will bring the cat. The cat is too old to travel. She says the cat will travel, or she will not come. Then the cat will travel." He almost smiled. She turned at last from the window. She looked at him. He was 35 now. She was 27. The arithmetic of it was no longer painful. "Caspian, you said to me 2 years ago, in the parlor at the Anchor, that you would spend the rest of your life proving to me that you had not been indifferent. I should like today to release you from that obligation. I require, instead, that you stop trying to prove a thing that has been proved, and that you trust, from this day forward, that I know what I know." "Marisol, that is, I think, the kindest thing you have ever said to me." She put her hand into the pocket of her gown and brought out the small, flat stone with a hole worn through it. She had carried it every day for 2 years. "It is a hagstone. The country people hold them lucky. I picked it up on the beach at Lyrebridge on the afternoon I saw you on the shingle, and I have carried it every day since. You will carry it now. I have carried it for both of us long enough." He closed his hand around the stone. "You took my piece with you when you left the inn at Drowmere," he said. "I know. You brought it back. I know. It is not, however, The same peace. No. It is a better one? Yes. He raised her hand. He kissed it. He had kissed it that way every day for 2 years, and the kiss had become the small private signature of their marriage. Mrs. Halloran is at the door. Tea is laid in the small library. The cat is on the chair you wish to sit in. I never remove the cat. No. You sit on the floor. She took his arm. They went, slowly, down the long gallery toward the small library, and somewhere in the house, Mrs. Halloran was setting out the cups, and the driftwood stick was on the mantelpiece, and the small flat stone with a hole worn through it was in the pocket of the Duke of Vexbridge. He had said, on the road from Tremaine, that he was indifferent. She had taken him at his word. She had walked out into the cold, and she had taken his peace with her, and she had given it back to him only when she had been certain that he had at last understood the true name of the thing he had asked her to walk away from. He understood it now. Thank you for staying with Marisol and Caspian to the very end. Their story began with a single cold word in a carriage in the rain, and ended in a long gallery on a wet afternoon. In between, it was a story of 7 years of silence, 3 days of pursuit, and 2 years of the small, steady work of marriage. Caspian believed, for 7 years, that loving her and saying so were 2 different things he could keep apart. He learned, the morning she left him at the inn, that they were not. Marisol believed, for 7 years, that she was waiting to be chosen. She learned on the road to Lyrebridge that she could choose first. If their story has stayed with you, leave a comment below telling me which moment you felt most. And if you have not yet subscribed, please do, because there are more stories of long silences and second chances waiting on this channel. Thank you for listening.